Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. Even though 2020 has presented us with the odd challenge, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And hello, welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your favourite centre-left weekly political and cultural podcast that dives into the political issues and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, we've got Sammy Schneidman coming back, your favourite American, as we take a look at the US presidential election campaign, US politics in the backdrop of what's been going on recently in terms of all the protests across all the cities and towns across all 50 states in the US and the implications that has with the general in November, which isn't that far away. So I hope you enjoy today's episode with Sam. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, please leave us a rating and a review and get all the updates on Socially Democratic or even the Dunn Street stuff. Follow us on our Dunn Street social media platforms, which is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Let's get today's episode. We're taping this one on a Monday lunchtime in downtown Melbourne. And joining me on the line from, I think, somewhere in upstate New York to catch up on what's going on in the United States, my good friend, and I would almost argue it's becoming a regular co-host, Sam Schneidman. How are you?
Good to see you, Stephen. Good to be speaking with you.
Indeed.
And yes, I am, in fact, in upstate New York.
You're so close to the Canadian border. One wonders why you just don't jump across that border and stay there for a while. Good
question. The border is not open, so that has been settled for me.
Rightio, there you go. Because my first question was, the last time we spoke, the Democratic primary had kind of wrapped up, where Bernie Sanders had pulled the pin and Joe Biden had become the nominee elect, and that's kind of where we left it. And coronavirus was really taking hold of, certainly. At
that point, we just had a global pandemic to talk about.
Yeah, and that was it, right?
A lot's happened since then.
A lot has happened since then. And my first kind of question really is, are we seeing the final days of the great American Republic? Like, is it over?
No, I don't think it is over, but in many ways, what is happening in the United States right now is challenging our institutions of representative sort of self-governance in a way, and with an intensity that it hasn't since, at least in any time after the Second World War. And that includes the tumult of the 60s, Vietnam War, the contested election of 2000. And what we're living through is quite a propitious time here in the United States.
This has a real not that I was around in 1968, although people do joke and make out that I predate that. This does have a real 1968 kind of vibe about it, though, doesn't it?
Well, yes, superficially it does. It has the political turmoil. It has the 1968 was a really interesting time in the United States. It was when the tide of the Vietnam War was turning politically here in the United States, as well as on the battlefield, where it was becoming clear that we were becoming mired in sort of a morass. And on top of that, here in the United States, you had some very significant political assassinations. It was the year that Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated and Martin Luther King. And George Wallace was also shot. He was, of course, the racist governor of Alabama who was running to get the Republican nomination for president that ultimately went to Richard Nixon. Now, what's also interesting in terms of the parallels between 1968 and 2020 is race and how our relationship with not just race in America, but racism specifically has come to the forefront of a presidential election. 1968, of course, was also the year that Richard Nixon ran successfully on the Southern strategy, which played into this whole idea of the term the silent majority and the concept of racial resentment among whites and a fear of a liberal upswell coupled with, racial disharmony and the scenes from riots in Chicago during the Democratic Convention, as well as in Watts.
Where does that analogy then start to fall apart when we compare 68 to 2020? What not that you were around in 68 either, but how does it feel different? Particularly when you look at the protests across the United States right now. Certainly, from what I can see myself and what I'm reading in the reports, the protests that are taking place across all the cities and towns in the United States in 2020, there's a lot more. People are remarking on the diversity of the people that are attending these rallies, that it feels like it's this groundswell and this mobilization of people to these rallies are bringing in all walks of life to that. And that must be worrying for Donald Trump and for the Republican Party this time around, as opposed to what it was like in 1968.
Absolutely. I think while it is very easy to draw parallels between America in 1968 and what's currently happening in 2020, there are some really important differences. For one, when Nixon famously ran on the Southern strategy, he did so with this guy named Lee Atwater, who is worth a Google. Brad Pascarell, who is Trump's campaign manager, is not nearly as cunning, and nor as Lee Atwater, and Trump is obviously not nearly as cunning as Richard Nixon. But beyond that, I think, and that does matter, right? Like, I think that Trump's incompetence, not only as an executive, but, as the steward of a political movement, will really come to undermine him as we get closer to the election. But the idea of this silent majority also has less political potency, especially when we look at the way that there is more social cohesion around the idea of race in the United States now than there was then. And white people and white voters have embraced the Black Lives Matter movement with unprecedented speed and at unprecedented scale. Just in 2018 alone, Black Lives Matter was a movement that did not have support among a majority of Americans. Now it is dramatically backed by a majority of Americans, by 25 percentage points at least, in terms of net positivity versus net negativity. So that has been a dramatic shift just within 2 years. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the way that social cohesion, which is easy to overlook with, images of rioting and, a movement that is nominally about race. It's easy to overlook that it's broadly supported.
Yeah, when I'm watching the TV and when the riots when the protests first started, and there was sort of a lot of offshoots of the protests that were leading to looting and a whole bunch of other stuff that's been covered in different ways by different media sources, I wondered about, one of my thoughts were, okay, how does this set up the Democratic Party for the 2020 election in November? Does this spiral out of control that it damages their ability to win? Does this galvanize Trump and his supporter base? How was Middle America, particularly undecided voters in battleground states like the Midwest, like Florida, like Ohio, Pennsylvania? What are those voters? How does this impact on how they're going to vote when they're watching this stuff on television each day? Do they come to the conclusion that, particularly those voters that might have voted Bush, Obama, Trump, do those voters look at the scenes on television and say to themselves, what's happened to our country? And do I vote for Donald Trump because he's trying to brand himself as the law and order president? Or do they reject that and say, well, clearly you're not the law and order president because you're in charge right now and our country's burning. So therefore, I'm going to vote for change. I wondered where that kind of voter was going to go with this momentum that was happening across the country. I want to get your thoughts on that. And there's some polling that's come out that actually has sort of indicated that it's some interesting stuff that is positive, I think, from a Democratic standpoint.
Well, there's no question that, when you look at what's happened with the fallout from the coronavirus pandemic moving into the ascension of the Black Lives Matter movement and really the way that it's occupied our attention over the last 2 to 3 weeks, that it is damaging not only for the president, but also for Republicans running for office more broadly. Again, this sort of, I think really the bottom line is that it reinforces Democratic enthusiasm. So one of the things that you'll hear about often as a negative for Joe Biden is this notion of the enthusiasm gap, where the voters who identify as very excited or enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden is significantly smaller, not only by a historical precedent for other Democratic nominees, but also compared to Trump, the voters that are excited to vote for him. I think at one point it's only 74% of Biden voters were excited to vote for him. But this is made up for by the excitement among Democrats to vote against Trump. I think what we can do is just look at the most recent election that took place here in the United States, which was a Democratic primary in the state of Georgia. The Democratic voters cast close to 1 million votes in the Senate primary there, which is more than triple the number during this 2016 primary. What's interesting is that Georgia was also the subject of a massive voter suppression campaign where voting precincts in predominantly Black areas had machines that didn't work and hours long lines, and ballots for people who requested to receive them by mail were not sent or never received. And despite that, Democrats still showed up to vote in overwhelming numbers. If you look beyond that, Trump is ahead by only 2 points in the state of Arkansas. Now, Joe Biden and the Democrats are not going to win the state of Arkansas. But what that means is if that number is true and Donald Trump is only ahead by 2 points in the state of Arkansas, it means that Republicans are in trouble in a lot of other places. For the first time ever, a Republican senator in the state of Iowa by the name of Joni Ernst is trailing her Democratic challenger by 3 points. Now, since 2014, she's never trailed any sort of challenger in any type of polling. So what's been happening, certainly undermines Trump's ability to paint himself as a tough man. Law and order certainly loses its credibility when a vast majority of these protests have been peaceful. And then beyond that, the images of violence that you do see generate overwhelming political support against the use of force on peaceful protesters. But I think to me, what is most interesting is the way that the Black Lives Matter movement will shift American politics on the local level. And that's going to be something to really pay attention to.
Yeah, let's pick up on that. Reading a number of polls that came out a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was the CNN one that started to break down, because I think we've all learnt our lesson from 2016 about reading too much into national polls. And it's more...
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I know that, for a while...
We don't have a popular vote here in this country, right? So, the polls to pay attention to are on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah, and so when that... Because, Joe Biden, since he won the nomination for the Democratic Party, has been leading Trump on the national polls, and a lot of the numbers were very, very similar to where Hillary Clinton was versus Trump at this same point. And obviously we all saw how those numbers then tightened, and obviously then we have Donald Trump as our president for the next 4 years. But those state-based polls, interesting numbers coming out of those ones, and I don't have them in front of me, but I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. Certainly the ones that they looked at were in those Midwest states that Trump picked up in 2016 that surprised everyone, that sort of blue wall that collapsed, particularly paying attention to Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio as well. Ohio, for some Democrats, I think maybe 2 years ago, were thinking it's almost. And when I was over in the States in 2018, was it, or 2019? In 2019, I was talking to some folks there in DC, and they were sort of saying, "I don't even know why we got Ohio on our map. Like, it's just so far gone now." That's come back to being, within the margin of error, a line ball between Trump and Biden. We've seen huge numbers turn around in North Carolina in favor of the Democrats, huge numbers turn around for Wisconsin. But also then if you extrapolate those numbers of where the swings are, they vary. In some states, it's non-college educated white men or women that are moving towards Joe Biden. I think that might have been in the Wisconsin poll. But in other states like Ohio or like Michigan, it's college-educated white voters that are moving towards Joe Biden. So he's getting a sort of a different mix of voters across different states, which I find quite interesting. What do you draw from a lot of that data that came out of those CNN polls last week?
Well, I think what is interesting to me is that right now, as things stand, Joe Biden is leading among women by a record margin of 25%. However, he is trailing Donald Trump among men by 6%. And it's going to be really interesting to see how if that holds true, will that be applied to voting patterns, particularly in suburban areas, which is sort of the most contested voting blocks across the country. That being said,
which is where he did really. I mean, Joe Biden did super well in the primaries. I know it's the primaries, but he really did very well against Bernie. Was in the suburbs.
Exactly, and that is really where things unfolded for Hillary Clinton, particularly in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So, at least on that front, if I were Joe Biden, I'd feel pretty sanguine about that. That being said, how is that going to apply to these down ballot races of people running for Senate? And then how does the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of the fevered pitched momentum around it at this particular point in time filter out to things like mayoral races and other city council type offices? So there's no question that, at least at a top line level, Joe Biden has a lot of momentum at this point, certainly from a media narrative standpoint. From a polling perspective, what he's looking at has to be pretty encouraging. And, I think in the best case scenario for Joe Biden at this point where things stand on June 14th, the map, the 2020 map could shape up to look a lot like 2008, with Arizona replacing Indiana as the sort of unexpected, traditionally red state that flipped to blue. One thing that also really spells trouble beyond that Arkansas polling margin that I mentioned earlier for Donald Trump is the fact that Texas is really tight, Georgia is really tight, North Carolina is really tight. These traditionally have been states that the Republican Party has always been able to rely on. And so when I look at a state like Georgia, what you're really going to be focusing on there is whether or not voter suppression is going to tip the scales in 2020 towards Donald Trump, the way that it did in the 2018 gubernatorial race there, away from Stacey Abrams and to Brian Kemp.
Are we seeing particularly with that Democratic primary that was held just recently in the state of Georgia, are we seeing sort of a test case strategy for the Republicans going into the major elections in November in terms of voter suppression? Are they trying out some tactics here that they're going to adopt?
Oh, I think that those tactics, I think it's an open strategy at this point. And they're not going to adopt it. They've been adopted. I think so when we take a step back and look at what obviously happened in Georgia, we also have to think about the fact that there is an ongoing pandemic of a respiratory disease that is spread very easily among large groups of people in indoor places. There's going to be a huge fight over mail-in voting here in the United States over the coming months, and whether or not that states are going to make a move toward adopting a mail-in voting first way of conducting their election business. Now, if that happens, you'll see a lot of fighting around sort of the rules and policies to make that happen. Now, for listeners in Australia, I think one of the important peculiarities of American politics to understand is the hyper-locality of the way that we elect offices in this country under the auspices of federalism. So in states, every state has an official whose job it is to sort of oversee the conducting of elections and the management of voting. And that position in all of these states is known as the Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State is a politically held office that is voted upon. So what you'll see is that the people who are in charge of managing elections on a state-by-state basis are essentially political representatives. And it is impossible to divorce their policy making and the decisions that they make from the fact that they have a party affiliation. And this is for Republicans or Democrats. It just so happens that one party is openly for allowing as many people to vote as possible versus another party.
We didn't get a chance I went back and looked at my notes from our previous conversation, and there was one topic that we didn't talk about that had just happened in our last podcast, which was the Wisconsin local elections that were happening. And it was at the height, I say it was the height of coronavirus, but I don't know actually when there is a peak in coronavirus in the United States. But at that point...
Well, actually, I think it's becoming... It's getting worse.
Yes.
It's getting worse.
Yeah. So, but it was like this was a serious problem, right? And there was a move by the Wisconsin legislator to House to enable
the governor tried to postpone it. The state legislature said, no, we don't want you to do that. And the reason why they did that in the state of Wisconsin is because, unlike on a federal level, in many states across the country, in addition to having offices like our attorney generals and our district prosecutors and our state secretaries who manage voting, in many states, the positions of the Supreme Court are also political offices. And that is the case in Wisconsin, where voters actually vote for judges to serve terms on the state's Supreme Court. Now, the reason you would think that a Democratic primary in 2020 would not attract so much partisan fighting around how the vote is actually to take place in the middle of a pandemic. However, and this gets to the whole thing about voter suppression, on the day of the Democratic primary in Wisconsin, there was also a vote for a seat on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. And the Republican who was the incumbent was in a lot of trouble. And there was definitely a Democrat who was going to, who looked like he was poised to take the seat. And the state Republican Party and the Republicans who control the state legislature in Wisconsin were adamant about a vote that went forward as scheduled and in person, because their bet was that would depress turnout. And the more that turnout was depressed, the more likely it was that the Democrat would not prevail in that state Supreme Court election. Now, it just so happened that Democrat narrowly won, like by less than a percentage point, and will assume that seat. But I think that sort of gets into the fact that one part, the Republicans very much do not want to make it easier to vote when it comes to living this new reality in the age of coronavirus.
And the governor, I think the governor in Wisconsin, just to pick up on that one, Sam, as well, the governor in Wisconsin also tried to extend the date upon which mail-in ballots, or postal votes as we would call them in Australia, he wanted to extend that date to give voters more time to send in their mail-in ballots. And that got challenged in the Supreme Court of the United States, in which the ruling by a majority of the Republicans on the Supreme Court quashed the governor's seeking extension.
It's true.
I'm worried about that ruling, because I'm worrying that's going to set a precedent going forward, because obviously what's going to happen now across a whole bunch of different states is Democrats are going to try and extend the opportunity for voters to send in mail-in ballots. And I think that Republicans are going to try and send all of this to the US Supreme Court. And I think that we're going to find that a Republican-stacked Supreme Court now is going to rule in favor of the rule in favor of not allowing voters an opportunity to vote.
Well, I think that, when we talked earlier in our conversation about the parallels and dissimilarities between 1968 and 2020, I think what really stands out to me about this election in particular is that it is really the first time you're hard pressed to go back through American history and find a federal level election where concerns about legitimacy and the integrity of the outcome are as well-founded as they are in the year 2020. Now, part of that is by the fact that Donald Trump has made a political calculus to cast doubt on the outcome of an election, as he has done over the last many, many years. And then beyond that, there is an open voter suppression strategy among the Republican Party across various states. Our judiciary, not just the Supreme Court, but down through the federal appeals court system and the district courts, is viewed with skepticism for being deeply partisan. And the scenario that I am concerned about as a citizen is, with coronavirus being what it is, if there is a large-scale shift to a vote-by-mail system, it's very possible that we will not know who the winner is of this year's election, not only not on the night, but for up to a few days after the actual election. Now, I said at the top of our conversation that, our republic is being tested in a way that it really hasn't been, at least since the Second World War. And a good historical touch point for this would be the contested election of 2000. Now, of course, we all know what happened there, but there was a lot of faith in the system because ultimately because of the way the rhetoric that was used not only by Al Gore, but by George Bush. And though it was contested as it was and went up to the Supreme Court, there was an acceptance among the citizenry in the end result. If that sort of chaos happens here in 2020, I think that's much more concerning.
The other thing I want to think, that you were talking about the importance of this election, and you painted a pretty dreary kind of picture of things are tight on election night, which I do worry about. And 2020 has been such an insane year that, I wouldn't discount any kind of crazy scenario in terms of what happens on election night and whether Donald Trump accepts a result if he was to lose. But the importance of this election, given that there's a census happening and redistricting will be occurring as well, I just think that not only is the getting rid of Donald Trump out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue such an important component to this, but here is a great opportunity for the Democrats to take back control of the Senate, to give themselves a bigger buffer in the House, but also those down ballot races, not just state houses, which is so important when it comes to redistricting of boundaries after the census. But now, certainly from the Black Lives Matter campaign, the focus has really started to come upon electing what the colour of change are referring to as champion prosecutors. With all these protests going on around the country, eventually folks are going to want to start to see some change. In your policing laws and the way that your police conduct themselves. I just want to get your thoughts on that. And I'm very cognizant. I don't want to have a conversation today about Black Lives Matters in that, two middle-class white guys talking about it. I want to stay away from that and more so about the sort of continue with the conversation that you and I have been having now for the better part of 6 months about the politics and heading up to the election.
Sure.
But just talk about the significance of this 2020 campaign. This is so, so important. For so many reasons.
Well, I said earlier, one of the things that's most interesting to me is the way that this Black Lives Matter movement shifts American politics at the local level. So one of the things that we've talked about is the way that we vote for every sort of level of office here in the United States. There's an old joke that we'll vote for town dog catcher.
And you do.
Yeah, we did it as a thing, I guess. So one of the positions that we vote for here in the United States is our local prosecutors, called district attorneys. And the politics around that over the last at least 30 years have been sort of this tough on crime, lock people up, and, really sort of the heir to the 1994 crime bill, 3 strikes and you're out sort of politics. Now that has shifted it definitely within the last 2 years, and is a testament to the grassroots power of the Black Lives Matter movement. So there has been a shift towards an openness for progressive style prosecutors who want to reduce the prison population, who want to look at alternatives for incarceration as a way to sort of deal with criminality, and people who want to be focused on restorative justice. If Australians are looking for a couple of names to look up, I encourage you to look at Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, who dramatically reduced the prison population there even before COVID-19 hit, and who is a child of one of the people in the Weather Underground. And then another person to look at is Tiffany Caban, who ran unsuccessfully for district attorney in Queens and is closely associated with AOC. But these were sort of the highest profile progressive prosecutors. And that whole movement towards looking towards restorative justice, alternatives to incarceration, and a reduction in prison population is something that has widespread popularity now, just in the last 2 to 3 weeks after the ascendancy into the mainstream of the Black Lives Matter movement. Beyond that, I'm really interested to see how this is going to impact mayoral and city council elections. The reason for that is because police unions in this country have traditionally been untouchable for decades, have been very potent on the, have been very powerful politically on especially the local level. And so you're going to have a lot of mayors and city council members who are going to be forced to take a stand on whether or not they want to defund and abolish the police. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
It's such sorry, you go. Sorry, Sam.
Well, no.
I was just going to say, it's picking up on that point, abolishing the police. Last year, when I took the Dunn Street US delegation mission over to the States, and we had a meeting in Washington. No, it was in New York, actually, the head office of the ACLU. And it was the very first time I ever heard of the term or referencing to abolishing police. And there was 10 of us, 11 of us in the room, all Australians. In fact, one of us in the room was a former ministerial advisor to the police minister in the Victorian state government. And all of us, no one said anything in the room at the time when they mentioned about the abolition of the police. All of us thought we misheard what the ACLU advocate had said. And I myself thought, oh, no, she didn't say the abolition of the police. Why would you do that? That sounds insane. And I don't want to, if I had a bit more courage, I would have said, excuse me, sorry, did you just say abolition of the police? But I didn't want to say that because I don't want to be the idiot that then asked the dumb question in which she would have said, no, of course not. Why would I say that? What are you, an idiot? No. And afterwards we walked out, we all looked at each other and said, did they just advocate abolishing the police? So from an Australian standpoint, that was baffling. Now I wish I could go back into that room and go, all right, can we please unpack that? And I've spent a lot of time in the last sort of 4 weeks reading more about this concept, also defunding the police. Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly all of that means? It doesn't, I don't think it speaks to exactly what we would interpret it being, but it certainly goes some way to changing the way in which you fund the police in the United States, but also talk about the way that the police are set up initially, because it is fundamentally different to how it is in Australia. Just give your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really good story to tell, because I think a lot of people here in the United States have had sort of the similar reaction. So I think what is unique about the United States is the extensiveness of police here in this country. So broadly speaking, in Australia, there are 2 levels of police. There's the federal police and there's the state police. Can you please confirm that?
I can confirm that.
Good. I want to make sure I'm right on that. Here in the United States, we have way more layers of police. We have school district police. We have county police. We have city police. We have state police. We have the FBI. We have the Bureau of Prisons. We have drug enforcement, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents. We have investigators of financial crimes. We have police for not only the Secret Service, there's the Federal Reserve Police, there's the FBI Protective Service, there's the Federal Protective Service. So there's all these levels of policing, and it is impossible to look at American policing and not acknowledge the level of militarization within it, and to look at the sort of materials that are being used and how they are basically the same things that we provide our military. So, I mean, there's a great story where the Los Angeles County School District Police has said they're going to give up their grenade launchers, but not their armored vehicles. And you're just like, wait, did I hear that right? The LA County School Police has grenade launchers and armored vehicles, but it is true. And
even to the smaller end of the scale, like when you go to the States, all the times I've gone over there, I've always been absolutely baffled. Whenever you see any civil construction site in the United States, there's a cop car there. Or if there's any roadworks, there's a cop car there, just sitting there. There's a guy in the cop car just sitting there when there's construction work. What a waste of a resource. What is that police officer doing? Why do they need to be there?
I can't speak on that one, but maybe preventing people from stealing the copper wiring. I don't know. But, when we talk about, when there's talk of, in the United States, there's also, we talked about this militarization, right? But police are also de facto social workers in many cases, where if there is someone in distress, whether they're homeless or they're mentally ill or whatever is happening, or you needed to get a snake out of your house. I saw that today in the newspaper. You call 911 and they dispatch the police, and the police deals with it. And that's not an effective way for dealing with society's problems. And when you couple the fact that police are the first responders to many of our social issues with the fact that they're excessively militarized, you end up with way too much violence, and you end up with this state that is not responsive to its people's needs. And that really speaks to a lack of investment in social services in this country. And so I think the movement for abolition or defunding of the police is really a movement towards marshaling those resources away from militarization of our police and a shrinking of our police, getting more accountability of our police, and putting some of that a lot more resources into different professionals who can handle our societal issues that we ask police to deal with.
We're at a moment right now, I think, where there's similar parallels to perhaps the national conversation around gun reform after Sandy Hook.
I was going to say that. Yeah.
Are we but as we've seen with legislators' attempts to reform your gun laws in your country, it falls short. Are we, I fear, we're at this moment again, but when it comes to not just policing in the United States, but also, addressing systematic racism on so many levels of government, we're at this moment again where I think that the national conversation is moving into a space where, okay, let's identify some of the problems that we can change through legislation at all various levels of government. I'm a glass half full kind of guy, but I worry that are we going to see a similar kind of repeat performance with the way that you guys have addressed gun reform? Like you're looking at the Republicans in Congress, certainly in the Senate. There are so many bills just sitting there right now that are not getting addressed by Mitch McConnell and his mates. I just fear that at a national level, anyway, the same is going to happen. There's going to be this intransigence from the Republicans on this, and just sort of thinking, let's just ride this out for the time being, and then go back to the status quo. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this, shows the paradox of American politics, where there's this real groundswell of urgency at a local level, where there's already been a lot of change. I mean, the Minneapolis City Council has already voted to abolish the police, and there's been a lot of change at the local level already across the country. On a national level, our system just moves very slowly. Look at what happened after the massacre at the mosque in New Zealand, and the way that country responded with sensible gun reforms, or even more recently in Canada with a mass shooting there. And here in the United States, our political process can really slow things down. And so, after Sandy Hook, there was a real effort to get something meaningful done. But on a federal level, it was pretty watered down. Background checks and no ban on assault weapons. And public opinion was squarely behind it, but the legislative politics couldn't be worked out, and it failed. And this is a similar thing that we've seen on a lot of issues in the United States, particularly also on immigration. So we'll see what happens here, but there is now a big legislative fight on police reform, specifically around this idea of qualified immunity that police have. And, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not political pressure can be sustained to achieve a meaningful outcome here.
Do you think that the Democrats have had an inability to wedge Republicans in districts that are vulnerable at the moment? I mean, they must be feeling the blowtorch right now between, Donald Trump tweeting about them and their fear of then just by him simply tweeting about a Republican congressperson and saying, you're dead to me. And then therefore they're worried they're going to lose the next election. But at the same time, pressure coming from more local people leveraging those congresspeople and saying, hey, you've got an accountability to the electorate. You're up for a re-election in November. There is a mass swell of sentiment in your electorate, in your constituency, in your district, saying we want change, and you've got to vote. And if you don't vote this way, then we'll vote you out. I just don't get a sense that there is a lot of. There's a little bit of that going on, but not enough. I can't feel a wedge being driven right through like a truck through the middle of Mitch McConnell's Republican-dominated Senate at this point in time.
Yeah, no, I don't think that there is. And I think that sort of speaks to not only the political discipline of Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans, but also the issues that, politics has fought on here in the United States. And, keep in mind that what is happening now here, specifically with regards to police reform, is pretty significant in terms of the way that the politics around it have shifted from 2016, when Colin Kaepernick was doing his kneeling during the national anthem and was sort of excommunicated from the National Football League, to now where streets across the country are literally having Black Lives Matter painted on them, and there's hundreds of thousands of people on the street. So I think that despite there being broad public support for this movement, the devil is in the details. And, that broad support can wither away depending on whatever solution is being discussed. So I think on that point specifically, it'll be interesting to see whether or not, Republicans are going to move away, and particularly over the next 2 to 3 months, what political capital does Donald Trump still have left?
Yeah, I guess it speaks to the importance for American citizens to get out there and vote as well, and vote down the ticket, and get people into various levels of government that are actually going to enact change around a whole bunch of issues that have been raised. And, and not just Black Lives Matters as well, beyond that as well. I mean, I think that the coronavirus has also identified some of the systematic inequalities in America right now between the rich and the poor. And
certainly,
here's an opportunity, a coalescence of urgency across the country that can bring about change. Now, the man to do that, or to lead that, is Joe Biden. How do you think he's going so far since we last spoke?
Well, I think when we last spoke, I was concerned about his lack of digital reach. Donald Trump sort of, to mix a metaphor here, owns the airwaves on the internet. Now, that being said, Joe Biden has benefited from Trump's blatant idiocy and the media's focus on it. And one thing that's going to be interesting is that the next big media attention that Joe Biden is going to get will largely be positive, which is the selection of his running mate. So it'll depend on how that goes and how it's rolled out. But that being said, everyone is sort of like, Trump's blessing and curse is that he's a magnet for attention. The news media loves him, and they have been laser focused not only on his response to the pandemic, but also to his response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And when you couple those two together, the outcome hasn't been very good. And then, beyond that, the economy is also not doing well here in the United States. And the best case scenario is that unemployment is at 9% at the year's end. So Joe Biden certainly has a lot of things going for him, but the risks are still very much present, and that is his lack of reach online and a considerable disinformation campaign that is also going to be played out over 2020.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the way that Trump has handled everything, really, from the start of the pandemic back in early March, I guess, because those because he was restricted to the White House, he couldn't do the Trump rallies, which I think he gets a lot of good media out of, but also I think it's a good rallying call for himself. I think he gets energy from those rallies. And he got restricted to just doing these. So I think he thought that, well, what I'll do now is I'll do these briefings on a daily basis, which I don't think originally they intended to do. I think that this is something that was just sort of developed on the run. But eventually these started to turn into a complete disaster.
As with so much of his presidency.
Well, absolutely. I know. But he's a kind of president he's like a campaigner that feels out what he thinks is good and what's not good. I don't think there's a strategy behind it, but he sort of goes, okay, that's working.
I think one of the significant parts about his rallies is, you're right, he does get a lot of free media out of it, but these rallies place him above accountability in the sense that he's in front of a adoring crowd that is zealous in their passionate support for him, and cable news will sort of cover it uninterrupted and are on him like, a bug to light. And now that he hasn't had that outlet, people have begun to look at him with more of a lens of accountability. And people are starting to judge things like his response to the coronavirus, his handling of the economy under uncertainty, and his ability to lead the nation through a tumultuous period. And without that crowd that he personally derives energy from, but also which validates televisually a lot of the rhetoric that he espouses, that's the real sort of peril for him.
And the fact that when the protests happened, there was definitely nowhere he could go. Like, he kind of got, like, I mean, the guy retreated to his bunker, for God's sake. Like, this, like, he's really retreated. He's really absent in leadership. And I feel that this is a great, like, if Joe Biden and the Democrats can't construct an argument to the American voters in November, or from now until November, in which they can say to voters, hey, we get it. We understand why you voted for Trump 4 years ago. That makes sense to us. So you kind of give them a bit of agency there. But you would have to agree with us that when you voted for Donald Trump, you didn't think that unemployment would be up around 9%, which is around, 20 million people out of work. You didn't think 110,000 of our citizens had died of a pandemic that probably could have been prevented. You didn't think that our cities and towns would be divided and burning and protests and looting, and, you know, like, he's meant to this. He projects himself as being strong and tough, but he's actually just gone missing. If we can't construct an argument based around that to say to voters, it's okay to change your vote this time around, then, you know, you've almost got to pack up and give up, really, don't you? And I know that there's going to be things like, you know, they'll play every kind of card as they possibly can. Voter suppression. They'll take things through the various courts. You know, they'll do a lot of misinformation strategy online. All of that kind of stuff. That's all going to happen, and that's going to be really, really challenging. But if they can't make a fundamental argument to, you know, those what I call Bush, Obama, Trump voters to either don't come out this time or come out and flip your vote, then I don't know. I put my hands in the air.
Well, there's an element of that, to be sure, Stephen, that, you know, those voters are ones that you want to go after, but certainly also you want to expand the electorate. And the electorate, no two elections features sort of really the same electorate. And that's where organizing becomes so important. You've got to be able to bring new voters into it, register them, and turn them out, especially voters that sat out last time. And, you know, people talk about this, you know, Obama-Trump voter, but I think what we're going to now see is that there are a lot of lifelong Republicans who are going to defect away from Trump this time. And so the focus on that mythical Obama-Trump voter, while very important, is not the end-all, be-all. And I think what we're going to be seeing is a lot of sort of establishment Republicans defect from the party and potentially support Joe Biden, who is significantly more palatable to a broader to those types of voters than was Hillary Clinton or even Obama.
Yeah, and actually, you make a really good point there. I guess what in my analysis of focusing on those undecideds or those persuadables, I'm just actually assuming that the Democratic base, if they are not motivated, I mean, I'm not suggesting you don't do a turnout election. Obviously, you do that, right? But if the Democratic base are not motivated to turn out and vote in this election, of all elections, then, you know, come on.
Well, I think you definitely are seeing that. And I go back to what happened in Georgia with, you know, turnout being there 3 times what it was in 2016 for a primary. So this election is absolutely a referendum on Donald Trump, and it's going to be interesting to see, you know, how it turns out, obviously. But Trump inspires visceral reaction, and that's what he really counts on. And so there's a significant portion of Democratic voting base that while they may not be particularly enthused about voting for Joe Biden, would walk over coals to vote against Donald Trump.
Well, we shall see. It is a long way to go as well, and that's the other thing I have to keep on reminding myself. Like, it's only June 15. We've still got.
Well, I mean, yeah. So in the first 6 months of this election, of this year, we had the debacle of the Iowa caucus, where they couldn't count the results properly. We had the Joe Biden's campaign was on death's door and then miraculously came back.
You wrote it off.
I totally did. And as did a lot of other people. Yeah. We had an unforeseen global pandemic, the cratering of the United States economy. We've had unprecedented turnout in American streets to protest, not just for civil rights, but against ingrained, institutionalized, and systemic racism in this country, which I think is very significant. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next 6 months. I think you can certainly expect a fever-pitched battle over how voting happens. You can expect a debacle around the conventions and Trump starting up his rallies again, particularly in states where coronavirus cases are on the rise. And I think you're also going to be seeing a lot of dissatisfaction with Congress's inability to address sort of the dire economic needs that have resulted because of the pandemic.
One last question before we wrap up. The conventions, how do you have any insight into, particularly for the Democrats, how they are going to organize this in a corona environment?
I don't know how it's going to happen on the Democratic side. I can imagine that they're probably pretty close to not doing it in person for two very simple reasons. One is the logistics behind pulling an event off at that scale with such little time to be able to do it, and with a significantly smaller staff presence is almost insurmountable. It's almost impossible to do that. And then I think the Democrats just don't want the political risk of getting a bunch of people together in an indoor environment, chanting and screaming, and potentially risking a major outbreak, not only in Milwaukee, where the event was supposed to take place, but in other places when convention goers go back home. Democrats are obviously running to be responsible stewards of government and the economy, and that's sort of undermined if you're saying we're going to manage coronavirus well and capably. That's undermined when you bring a bunch of people together like that. So on the Democratic side, I'd sort of be putting my money on a above 50% chance that it does not go off in person. And part of me also thinks that this is a really good opportunity for Joe Biden to make up some ground in the digital sphere and really extend his reach on social media platforms and through digital media.
And for the Republicans, it is too irresistible for Trump to not have the RNC convention, right? And it was scheduled to be in North Carolina, from memory, and now
it is scheduled to be in North Carolina. Yes, which just said that they can't guarantee Donald Trump's campaign that they're going to be able to have a full-scale rally indoors because of a few reasons. Again, sort of like the ability to support it with businesses being open at the rate that they are. And then also for the very obvious health risk reasons. It's the converse of what I just mentioned with the Democrats and Joe Biden. Donald Trump is trying to strong arm his way through this election, and anything that forces him to stop and surrender the optics of being in charge to sort of the coronavirus pandemic just is not politically wise for him, which is why they are pressing forward and urging and planning to have a in-person convention in Jacksonville, Florida, where I might point out cases are significantly on the rise in the state of Florida.
That's insane. Anyway, are we done? Shall we leave it there? Have we covered off everything we wanted to cover today? Because we've done a fair bit.
We have done a fair bit. Yeah, I think we are done.
It was great talking to you.
Yes, likewise, always.
And we'll touch base soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.